Thank you for that. Thank you so much. My name is Varuna Srinivasan. I'm one of the coaches of the conference, and I have the very distinct honor of introducing our moderator for the day, Dr. Ijeoma Opara. We were introduced to her and heard about her from one of our committee members, Sia, who had nothing but amazing things to say. And so we couldn't be more excited for her to moderate this very important talk. So without further ado, let me introduce her. Dr. Opara is an assistant professor in the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Yale School of Public Health and the Director of Substance Abuse and Sexual Health, the SASH Lab. You can go to www.oparalab.org to learn more. Dr. Opara's research focuses on strength-based approaches for youth substance use and HIV prevention. Her secondary focus is on utilizing racial and gender-specific strategies in prevention for Black girls. Dr. Opara is currently funded by the NIH Director's Early Independence Award, which will fund a 5-year youth substance use prevention and mental health community-based study for urban, racial, ethnic minority youth in Paterson, New Jersey. Dr. Opara is also a licensed social worker and has worked primarily with women of color living with co-occurring disorders and court-involved urban youth. Dr. Opara defines herself as a community-based participatory researcher with experience in working with youth and community organizations dedicated to reducing substance use in urban communities. Her current research focuses on using strength-based approaches and strategies in prevention research, social work, practice, and treatment. Now handing it over to Dr. Opara to finally kick off our keynote. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so grateful to be able to share this space with everyone, especially with Dr. Roxane Gay, because we're going to be talking about really important issues, really timely issues pertaining to how we can address our trauma, and also really acknowledging the impact of women's mental health, especially during this time. And I think even during this week is an important conversation that we're going to be having. So I'm truly am grateful to be here, and thank you for even having this conference. So without further ado, I'm going to just introduce Dr. Roxane Gay. It's an honor. Dr. Roxane Gay is an author and cultural critic whose writing is unmatched and widely revered. Her work garners international acclaim for its reflective, no-holds-barred exploration of feminism and social criticism. With a deft eye on modern culture, she brilliantly critiques its ebb and flows with both wit and ferocity. Words like courage, humor, and smart are frequently deployed when describing Roxane. Her collection of essays, Bad Feminists, as an example, is a universally considered the quintessential exploration of modern feminism. NPR actually named it one of the best books of the year, and Salon declared the book trailblazing. Her powerful debut novel, An Untamed State, was long listed for the Flaherty-Dunnan First Novel Prize. In 2017, Roxane released her best-selling memoir, Hunger, a memoir of my body, which was called Luminous, intellectually rigorous and deeply moving by the New York Times. She also released her collection of short stories, Difficult Women. The Los Angeles Times says of the collection, there's a distinct echo of Angela Carter or Helen Oyeyemi at play. Dark fables and twisted morality tales sit alongside the contemporary and the realistic. In 2018, she released Not That Bad, Dispatches from Rape Culture, a valuable and searing anthology. It has been described as essential reading and a call to arms by its readers. In 2020, Roxane released Graceful Burdens, an incisive collection of funny, enraging, and hopeful stories of women's empowerment and escape, as well as a graphic novel called The Sacrifice of Darkness. Roxane was the first Black woman to ever write for Marvel, writing a comic series in the Black Panther universe called World of Wakanda. Roxane co-hosts Here to Slay with Tracy McMillan Cotton, a podcast which with an intersectional perspective on celebrity, culture, politics, art, life, love, and more. She also pens the Work Friend Advice column for the New York Times. And in 2021, she began her publishing imprint with Robe Atlantic, Roxane Gay Books. She has several books forthcoming and is also at work on television and film projects. Roxane fronts a small army of avid fans on social media. I am one of them. And when she finds the time, she dominates the occasional Scrabble tournament. So thank you so much, Dr. Roxane Gay, and welcome, to this discussion. We're so happy to have you.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
Wonderful. So I also want to share with the audience that that I and Dr. Gay will open it up for questions and discussion after we talk about a strict structure of specific questions pertaining to the topic of today. So please feel free to drop any questions that you have in the chat, and the conference organizers will share them with me, and I will facilitate those discussions. So I want to start off the discussion on trauma writing. Dr. Gay, it's something that you have taught many audiences, including students at Yale, if I'm correct, and clinicians as a technique to heal from trauma. So just in your words, can you just explain to us what trauma writing is?
Well, I think trauma writing can be a lot of different things, but in the context that I teach it as how do we write about trauma for audiences? And so it's more focused on creative writers and thinking about the best ways to write about trauma in both fiction and nonfiction that convey the breadth of trauma, the depth of it, the severity, and how there is no singular narrative about trauma. And so how do we do these things without traumatizing ourselves further, if we're traumatized, without traumatizing our audiences, while staying true to the experiences of trauma, without universalizing one person's experience. And so, it's really just sort of trying to develop a set of practices to write about trauma effectively and ethically.
Thank you. Thank you. And I want to just hear from you and talk a little bit about your journey as being a Black woman and a writer in these spaces. You focus on specific topics that I think ring dear to the heart of many Black women. And so I just want to just hear from you and just, to tell the audience, why do you focus on specific topics? Like, what does that mean for you in the process of trauma writing?
I think like everyone have interests and things that I prioritize and value. And, when I started to think about writing trauma, it was after I had written my memoir, Hunger. And I was curious about is there a way to teach students how to write about trauma? And it just went from there. And, as a writer, as a thinker, you gravitate towards certain topics. And for me, those topics tend to be about the issues that women deal with, especially Black women and fat women, queer women, people who, of course, embody intersections of those identities. And those are the things that I prioritize in my work.
That's one of the questions I wanted to ask you was about your book, Hunger. And can we just talk a little bit more about the relationship with sexuality and food? I actually I have a study that I actually did a couple of years ago that's going to be coming out that focused on stress and eating and overeating and binge eating amongst Black women. And it was actually a study that I did with a colleague with college students, and they identified these patterns of overeating and how it related to racial discrimination and so forth. So I'm curious to know your thoughts on that. Your thoughts on writing Hunger and the relationship between race, sexuality, and food, and what that even means.
When I came to write Hunger, it's because I was trying to think of what I should write next, because I sold it before Bad Feminist even came out. And I was thinking, well, the thing I don't want to write about is fatness. And anytime anytime I feel like I don't want to do something, I know that it's because I'm afraid. And if there's fear there, that means there's probably something intellectually valuable that I need to explore. And so that's how I came to writing Hunger. And in writing Hunger, I was trying to look at the relationship, like how to write a memoir of my body, first of all, and to look at the relationship between trauma and fatness more than sexuality. And for me, fatness was an absolute not choice per se, but it was a deliberate sort of response, because I thought if I made myself bigger after experiencing a trauma when I was 12, then I could make myself safer. And of course, you know, there is no such thing as safe in many ways, but the book sort of looks at that journey. And then, of course, trying to figure out, okay, what do I do now? How do I sort of undo the damage? Which is not to say that fatness is damage, but to say that some of the behaviors that I developed in the wake of trauma were no longer serving me. And hunger offered me an opportunity to really start to explore that. And since the book has come out, so many people have told me that they can make a direct link between fatness and trauma. And it's hard to talk about, because especially in fat activism, you never want to feel like you're justifying fatness, because, you know, we should be body neutral. Like, our bodies are our bodies, and we shouldn't have to explain or defend them to anyone. And so people can be uncomfortable understanding that there is sometimes a link. And so I do talk about that openly. And I want more people to understand that every fat person has a different story, and nobody needs to explain their fatness. But for some of us, there's a link that we need to sort of talk about or uncover.
Absolutely. I love that. And I applaud you for pushing through your fear too, because your book was all your books really are such a blessing to many people. So I'm grateful for you for that. Just to talk a little bit about what you mentioned, the trauma connected with possibly, with eating and fatness, for example. Like within the Black community, as you're aware, the perceptions of mental health disorders and even specifically eating disorders are often not seen. And I saw that even in my work, that eating disorders, or, Black people or Black women especially, are less likely to be diagnosed with eating disorders than white women. So I'm just curious to know, especially as we have this, we have an audience of clinicians and soon to be clinicians. I'm wondering, in your own words, how do you think that psychiatrists and other mental health clinicians can effectively be aware of these racist practices, or how racial discrimination or stress, how that can impact not only eating behaviors, but just impact, our mental health, overall, and, try to incite some change? Like, how do you think like psychiatrists or clinicians can even go about understanding this?
Yeah, I think that education is key. And I'm not necessarily referring to education in the classroom, but reading diversely goes a very long way to understanding the experiences of others. Something as simple as recognizing that women of color deal with the same issues that white women deal with, that we can be vulnerable, that we can be broken, that we experience pain, and that we do all kinds of things to cope with that pain. And so it's important to pay attention and to not dismiss certain experiences as if we don't deal with them, because we absolutely do. And, mostly it just requires seeing Black women and women of color more broadly as human. And you would think that's very easy, but it's not. And it's not something that we can assume people are doing. So it starts there. And sorry, phone anyway, did something crazy. Our front door in New York is hooked up to my phone. So anytime someone rings the doorbell, it just, my phone.
Oh, the doorbell rings.
Anyway, my wife's home, it's fine. But yeah, it just requires empathy and understanding people. And unfortunately, we have a long way to go with regard to that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we're going to talk about it.
Yeah.
So to get back to trauma writing, it's a process that I think is remarkable. And I think that it's such a healing process. And I'm wondering, do you think this is something that psychiatrists can use in their practice and can actually teach patients? And can they even practice it themselves? Like, I'm curious to know your thoughts on that.
I don't know. I think anything is possible. And I absolutely think that it could really help clinicians to learn how to write about trauma, and also, frankly, how to read about trauma, and find ways of teaching some of those skills to their patients, because it can be incredibly cathartic and incredibly useful to write about trauma. You know, I don't know how to approach it from a clinical sense, because I'm a creative writer and I focus on creative writing. But I do know that so many people would benefit from being able to tell their story, even if it's not for an audience, even if it's just for them, or even if it's something they only use in a clinical context. And I think that, you know, talk therapy is great. And I'm a fan, but I know that writing has been as therapeutic as anything else. And there's something private about writing that feels a little safer, where like if I put it on the page, it's still sort of my secret, but I'm not carrying it alone. And so I would love to see more clinicians thinking about, like, how do I write about trauma? How do I encourage my patients to write about trauma in ways that serve them rather than some sort of like grand psychiatric narrative? And so it's definitely something I would love to see more of.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's something that I engaged in without realizing I was engaging in it when I was a social worker. You know, I would encourage my clients. I work primarily with youth, specifically girls, and I would encourage them to write their story, tell their story, and see how not only how powerful your story is, but kind of just to be able to present that and get that weight off of your shoulders. And, you know, and be able to, you know, tell, you know, once you tell your story once, maybe you will be able to tell someone else and it could help others and so forth. So, you know, it was something that I didn't even really know was a thing, but, you know, but now I'm realizing how powerful it is. And even myself, I try to, you know, encourage even myself to tell my story to other people, to different audiences. And it's just so powerful. It can be very emotional. But, you know, I'm personally working through, you know, how to deal with those emotions and stuff. So I'm just grateful that that this is something that you're doing, you're writing about, you're teaching about it. And I definitely think it's something that clinicians should engage in more, especially psychiatrists. So I love that. And there was something so I wanted to ask you a little bit more about humanizing and caring for our patients. So I'm not a psychiatrist, but I know that something you mentioned earlier about listening to Black women, for example, and listening to us and acknowledging our pain. And I think it's something that sounds so simple, but people often that are working with us specifically, they view us as not human, right? And they don't realize that they're doing that, but they're viewing us as non-human. So when we complain about pain and when we complain about sadness, well, it's often dismissed, from people. And so I'm wondering, how can we? And I think that a lot of these conversations are happening, but then it's like, okay, what next, right? So like I'm wondering, just in your work, how do we push people to see us as human? And maybe not just Black women in general, but I am discussing Black women just because of the intersections that we, you know, often, belong to, that contribute to our marginalization and oppression. But, you know, just for the sake of, you know, the discussion, I'm curious to know, to have this discussion on, how do we teach people how to see us as human? You know,
we don't. We absolutely do not, because we don't have to. We are human. And there's literally nothing we can do to teach people who would not otherwise see us as human. Like, we can't do that work. It's them that have to do that work, who have to, you know, first of all, admit that they're racist, and then confront it and recognize that there is redemption there if you're willing to do the work of, you know, acknowledging the wrong, and if necessary, creating reparations to sort of address the harm, and then moving from there. But all too often in marginalized communities, we wonder sort of like, what can we do to make them not oppress us? And there's literally nothing we could ever do. And all too often people then engage in respectability politics, thinking, if I'm just a good enough Black person, maybe I won't get shot today. And it's like, no, you'll get shot anyway, because a racist is going to racist. So, it's really a question of making sure that we put the responsibility where it belongs and not on ourselves.
No, thank you for that point. And that kind of leads into my next discussion. So I know that you identify as a feminist. Can you just talk about your ideas around feminism and the exclusion of Black women in feminism? And can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, historically, mainstream feminism has focused on heterosexual, cisgender, middle-class and wealthy white women, frankly, to the detriment of all other women. Mm. And it's definitely changing, but change is slow. And a lot of women have long felt disenfranchised from mainstream feminism, which is, of course, what gave rise to womanism. But I believe that there's still room for us within feminism. And it's not that I expect us to be given that room, it's that we take it. We take the space that we have every right to occupy within feminism, because there's a lot of work to be done. And this idea that we should not avail ourselves of every resource possible, including feminism, simply because of, historical wrongs, I reject that. And I think it's important to hold feminism accountable, mm-hmm. and to demand that we are seen and known and understood, and that we don't create a hierarchy of whose needs are going to be met. We do it all at once. And that means that it's an immense undertaking. And this is, of course, where intersectionality comes in, because you can't separate race from identity, from sexuality, from body type, gender expression, et cetera. These things all work in concert, and they certainly influence how we are seen and understood in the world. And as a feminist, that means that I have to also take all of these things into consideration when I think about sort of where I can put my efforts and my activism.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for that. Dropping gems. So, so how do you think, a lot of the work that I do, I talk a lot about empowerment. And I think we, as feminists, we talk a lot about being empowered. But it brings me back to this point about, and you didn't necessarily use these words, but I'm just paraphrasing, but kind of like how we put the burden on ourselves, like the weight of the world is kind of on us, to change people's perceptions and to fight for our, rights. And I just wonder, and this is a question that I'm sure you may have a different way of responding to it, but I'm just wondering, like, how can we empower our girls that are growing in this generation to challenge racism and sexism within this society? Is it something that they're supposed to be doing? Because, the feminist movement, the Black feminist movement especially, has been around for decades and has really led to advances in our field. But I just think about girls, and, I'm just curious to know, like, especially for, I think it's important because I'm sure we have some child and adolescent psychiatrists on the call and clinicians, like how can we work with girls to empower them so that they don't feel powerless in this world that, obviously doesn't view us as equal?
I think that we work with girls by teaching them to empower themselves, and letting them know that power is not something that has to be given to them, or permission to embrace power is not something that is given to them. It's something that they already have, and that they have to believe they deserve to wield. And that's a really challenging thing, I think, for almost all of us, especially if you are from a marginalized community where you are consistently and systemically disempowered. But, especially with young women, I love to believe that, those, especially like these little Gen Z and younger, these kids are fucking fierce. And so, like, listen to them, trust them. They know things. They know they're scary. I find them terrifying in the best possible way. And so, it's really about sort of, you are powerful. Here are the things that you are up against. And it's okay to acknowledge that and to recognize that there's only so much you can do in the face of systemic oppression. But that does not mean that you are less powerful. It means that there are just issues in this world that all the power in the world can't necessarily address, but you can certainly try, and go from there. There are no easy answers to these questions. Like, how do you teach a young Black woman to be empowered in a world where you can believe that you are powerful all you want until someone puts their boot on your neck and like grinds you into the ground. Like, and so in addition, it's like, how do you prepare people for navigating systems of oppression that frankly, most of us navigate for the entirety of our lives in one way or another. And so I like to, alongside talking about empowerment, which I think sometimes we overuse as a sort of placeholder for some of the more challenging work that needs to be done, is also sort of like, how do we prepare people for the realities of this world without extinguishing their fire? You know, my brothers think about this with their daughters all the time. Like, you know, like, how do I encourage my, you know, like for me, like my nieces are 11 and 10 and they're little spitfires. And so how do you like help them hold on to that? Because at some point, you know, like life kicks you in the teeth enough times and you start to dim your light. And so like, how do you encourage them to stay bright? And a lot of the time it's just like letting them be themselves and encouraging them to be themselves and supporting them in that sort of work of being themselves.
You know, it's funny. I would love to meet your nieces one day. But...
They're amazing. One of them is incredibly talkative. Like sometimes I'm like, girl, are you being paid by the word? Like, what is happening now? Please. We were in Paris for my brother's wedding. And so my niece was, of course, there. And we all got COVID and we're stuck in Europe for a very long time. And so my brother had left for his honeymoon when he found out. And so my parents and I were sort of splitting custody of the baby, who's not a baby, but we had to be in a hotel room with her for a week, just my wife and I and my niece. And that girl
was talking. I could imagine.
I'm just like, you have more to say? And like, she would like around a 7 a.m., you feel her little hot breath right here. And she's like, I'm hungry. And I'm like, girl, it's 7 a.m. No, feed yourself.
They are too much.
So I taught her to call room service. I sure did.
I love that. See, empowerment.
That's empowerment.
That's empowerment right there.
Like, aisle 0 and figure that shit out.
That's empowerment. And you as an adult ally is supporting her and showing her.
It is. It absolutely is.
That's a perfect example. Perfect example. And, you know, I feel sorry for my parents when I was a child, because I was a talkative child. I talked so much. I got in trouble so much in school. And I always had an opinion. But it kind of like created to be the person.
I mean, look at you now.
Right.
It worked. And I just wish that more often that we would have tolerance. Like every time I feel like irritated with her and just want to be like, could you please not? I think, why would I do that to her? She's actually not doing anything wrong. Because I mean, she's a wonderful child. She's well-behaved. She's just wonderful, sweet. She just talks a lot and has a lot of opinions. And it's just like, embrace that instead of sort of thinking that we need to make children smaller and make them sort of conform, you know, like there's a whole lot of real estate between sort of badly behaved and meek. And I really think that there's just so much space for us to unclench as adults and release some of that control and recognize that young people being themselves, whether they're exuberant or shy, whatever, is like the most powerful thing you can do is allow them that space.
Absolutely. You know, I'm so, you know, even though this is a funny discussion, it actually really does lead to some serious issues about how girls, especially girls of color, often are punished and their behaviors like talking too much or being bossy or something are often criminalized in the school system.
Absolutely. And they're often punished for it, for having an attitude, for being difficult. Meanwhile, white women and white girls, I mean, talk about difficult. They will talk crazy out of both sides of their face and not one single thing will happen to them. And so we also have to just, not we, you and me, but white people have to really start to shift their perceptions of Black women, of women of color, and women of color from different groups deal with different issues of misperception. And we have to hold space for all of those issues. But in speaking about Black women in particular, man, we really need to find a way for self-expression and for people to recognize that there are different ways of being in the world and that there's absolutely nothing wrong with most of those ways of being in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you're kind of hinting at too is like providing safe spaces for Black women and girls to be themselves and not worry about being judged, being criminalized, being oppressed, being attacked, as being, for me, in my work, I use intersectionality, for example, as like a framework for everything I do. So I try to look through this intersectional lens and all the work that I do within public health research. And I acknowledge, for those of you who are watching who may not really understand what intersectionality theory is, it's a theory that recognizes our race, our gender, our class, our disability, religion, sexual orientation, and how these, do not exist independently of each other, but they kind of each inform each other. And they create this complex experience of oppression and marginalization. So in my work, I look through this lens, and I think it's important that psychiatrists, clinicians also make an effort to look through that lens as well. Because a lot of the issues, like you mentioned, there's different issues that may impact women differently, depending on their positionality and depending on their social location in this world. And I'm curious to know, when we're thinking about trauma, what do you think are some of the issues? And I'm sure, we kind of rehashed on it, like racism and sexism, but, I'm just wondering if there's anything else that we haven't discussed, like what are some specific issues that you feel like contribute to trauma for Black women that we haven't discussed? And, how do you think we can cope with those issues?
Yeah, I think the primary issue that Black women deal with is that people think that we're so strong as to not experience pain. We're so strong as to not need help and support. Like this, nothing has been, I think, more damaging to Black women, other than racism, than the trope of the strong Black woman. And, I don't even begin to know how we overcome that. I don't even begin to know how we overcome that. So
it's almost as if like the resiliency of being able to get through racism and sexism and thrive is a punishment almost,
really, because we survive, it, like, people then weaponize that against us. Like, oh, if they can survive all of that, then they really are what I think they are. They don't need any help.
Yeah, exactly.
And so oftentimes our traumas are dismissed. They're not even recognized. And it's just, it can be really overwhelming. And it can be really overwhelming.
Can you talk a little bit about, if you're comfortable, about your identity as a queer Black woman and how that in itself kind of like impacts your work, impacts your journey, and talking about just talk a little about how you cope with the possible discrimination that you may face specifically because of your social location?
I'm a queer Black woman in the world that sort of doesn't believe I exist or wants to eradicate me. So I think that, you deal with those. But the reality is that, I deal with all kinds of nonsense, but I will say that it's different now than even when I first came out at 19. The world is different, at least pre the Supreme Court leak. We've gotten better, but it's easy for me to say that because right now I'm from the Midwest, but a few years ago I started living in New York and LA full time, and so you get to like ensconce yourself in a very delightful bubble,
like a bubble,
in a major city where, frankly, my sexuality is never an issue at all, and that's a huge privilege. Yeah. But like in New York, we live in the gayest neighborhood of Gayville, and in LA, it's fucking LA. Nobody gives a fuck. And so it's great. And it's great that we're even here. It's great that I was able to get married. And like, that's not something I ever thought was possible in my lifetime. And so some things are very good. And then, of course, you know, economic privilege buffets you from quite a lot. You can't buy your way out of racism, to be clear. And you certainly can't buy your way out of fat phobia, but you can insulate yourself from quite a lot of bullshit. And so as much as I recognize the ways in which I'm marginalized, I have to also acknowledge the immense privilege that I enjoy. And I'm crystal clear, and I always try to identify my subject position in all of my work so that people understand, like, though it may not be an issue for me, I understand that this is an issue for many, many people. And I wish that more people would do that, would identify the privileges that they enjoy, no matter what subject position they hold, so that people who don't have similar experiences understand why they don't have those experiences, and understand that sometimes there are systemic biases that you can't overcome without quite a lot of privilege.
Absolutely. And actually really being intentional and making effort to utilize resources when you do feel like it's even like it's a privilege to be able to recognize, wait a minute, I just, faced a microaggression, I'm going to do something about it.
And then also finding ways to make sure that, that you're not the only one who occupies a given space. A lot of people are like, I'm the first, I'm the only. And it's like, it's one thing to celebrate being the first, but if you're the only, that means that you haven't done anything to ensure that other people who share your identity are in those same spaces with you, which means that you have not done your job yet. And so I also think that creating opportunities for me, I focus on other Black women and other queer women, has been also a great way of allowing myself to sort of not give back, because that sounds so cheesy, but to ensure that I'm never the only one in the room.
I love that. And I recognize that. I remember you mentioned that I attended a talk of yours in Virginia. It was the Faculty Women of Color Conference. So I attended that talk, and I remember you talking about, and I don't know if you remember this, but I'm going to remind you. I remember you saying that if you were saying this to someone in the audience, if you need someone to look over your tenure,
she sent it to me.
She sent it to you?
She did. Yeah, that conference was not that long ago. The one in Arlington. Yeah, in fact, that's on my to-do list. I'm going to New York on Sunday. And so from LA, that's a very long 6-hour flight, 5.5 to 6 hours. It's great, actually, in that you can get a lot of work done. And one of the things I'm going to do on that flight is look over her research statement. She did fucking take me up on it. And
I would have too.
She should have. It was a genuine offer. So I was really thrilled when she sent it to me.
I love that. And, it's funny you mentioned, I strongly believe with you that when we're in these spaces, we need to use this opportunity to be able to support others so that we're not the only one. But then I also run into this, this feeling of, again, burden, right? This feeling of when we're in these spaces, like specifically like as Black female professors or Black clinicians in these spaces, and we're often the only one that Black students are running to for, advice, or people are running to for mentoring, and and so forth. So I'm wondering if you have any advice for how to even manage that so that it doesn't contribute to more stress and more harm to our mental health. We're still possibly giving back. We're still giving back to, our community.
Well, I think it's important to recognize that we can only do so much. And it's okay to say no. It's okay to have boundaries. And I think too few of us do this. And I include myself in that, because you just think, oh, I have to help everyone. But you can't help everyone. First, you have to help yourself so that there is something left of you to help others. And it's just so critically important to know that there's only so much that you can give others. There really is. I mean, like Mother Teresa, we're not all that, and the burden on, especially in academia, the burden on marginalized people to mentor and to serve on committees and to do this and to do that. You know, like we don't have the same job as our white peers. We simply do not, because this is not always the case, but oftentimes, you know, like Black students come to me and they're just like, how do I survive 4 years in this place? And I'm just like, well, here's what you need to do. So like, not only do we advise our students, but we end up being like their therapists too. And the person that they can turn to when they experience something that they know only we will be able to relate to. And so it is a really unfortunate burden. And, you know, one of the things that can be done to address this is, of course, hiring more diversely and making sure that you're not taking a Noah's Ark approach where I'm going to have like 2 Black women, and that's not enough. And also don't assume that they're going to get along, because a lot of times people think like, oh, we're just going to like have these 2 people, these 2 Latinx people. And then the assumption is that because we share this one thing in common, that we're going to be besties. And
that is so true.
I mean, we don't all love each other, and that's okay. That's okay. But I just, you know, I think burnout is real. And I think many, many people are functioning on fumes. And even though, you know, I'm always afraid of disappointing people and things like that, I'm trying, and I'm working on it in therapy. I'm trying to learn how to not only say no, but mean no, because my time and energy are finite. And it's just challenging. But yeah, like the no is a sentence. And it's a very important one.
It's a very important one. And it's empowering to even tell people that you can say no. Like, it's okay. The world will not end.
And I'm often sorry. Like, sometimes I'm happy to say no. Like, no, thank you. There's no money in the world that would let me say yes to you. And other times it's with real regret. And I do express regret. And if I can, I try to offer up, here's someone who might be able to help you. If I know that. Because you know, and I know that most people, when they're asking for things, are doing so in good faith. And so I want to be helpful. But still, I try very hard to stick to my no.
Yeah, no, that's excellent advice. Excellent advice. I'm curious, you talk about, you've mentioned this too in another talk that I attended of yours, but you talk about your relationship with your therapist. And I'm just curious to know, like, if there's, because someone like you, I'm sure you were very particular about what kind of therapist you would trust with your story, but with your mental health. So I'm just curious to know what are some of the qualities that your therapist has, and how do you think maybe that could kind of be taught to the clinicians on the call that are actively really trying to be more supportive to their clients or to their patients?
Yeah, my therapist is great. I've had so many therapists over the years, and some have been good and some have been bad. So like 2 therapists ago, it was a guy, Michael, and he was a total asshole. And I loved him because he didn't tolerate my nonsense. And it was like, oh, this is kind of a different perspective. Like, this guy's kind of a fucking dick, but it's useful. And then he retired to live on a boat and write screenplays, which is so LA. And I love it.
I love LA. I really do.
The best place on earth. I love living there. That is like my happy place. You know, and my therapist after that was this white woman who does like teaching white people to not be racist. But on the very first day, she was like, yeah, a colleague of mine was called the N-word. And she used the N-word. And I was like, I don't even use that word. And she was like, so comfortable. And then she's like, it's okay because I teach anti-racism. And I was like, oh, okay. So I actually, because I have a hard time like standing up for myself, I stayed with her for like a year. And then I just like could not do it anymore. And so long story short, my wife has been with the same therapist for 32 years. Oh, wow. And I know, it's incredible. Wow. And her therapist recommended my current therapist. And she is just incredibly thoughtful. She's really warm, which I did not know I wanted, because in general, I don't like that. But turns out I do. And she is always like asking for feedback. Like, so how are you doing now in this moment? Is there anything I could be doing better? Like, it's like a feedback loop. Like, she's the first therapist who has ever asked me, like, am I serving your needs?
I've never had that either. Wow.
And it just blew my mind. I was like, are you like asking for a teacher evaluation? What the fuck? And it's like, what?
Like, we're on the other end. We're like,
yeah. And she, like, we meet twice a week. I never thought I would do therapy twice a week, but my wife she used to go 5 days a week, and with good reason. And now she goes twice a week. And she told me that, like, when you go once a week, you spend like most of the time like doing catch up, and then you like get to an issue. But when you go twice a week, you can like do catch up, and then like you start the work and you can just continue the work 2 days later. So and so like she always brings it back to sort of like when we have our conversations and I'll be talking about something and she'll like, I think the root of this is sort of like, when you were 6. What, like, that's just a fake example, but like she brings it back and she really remembers sort of like the through lines of the things that I talk about. And so it's just been an incredibly helpful experience. Every time we finish a session, I feel better, but I also feel like I've made progress. And it's not like there's an end point. It's just that I feel like something has happened. Like I've been given a new sort of task to try. And I like, sometimes I'm like working on the same thing for weeks or months on end, but she at least makes it feel like it's possible to not get better, but to sort of become more of the person that I think I can be.
Yeah.
So
because we're human. So it's irrational for us to think that we're going to be perfect all the time, so we're never going to be perfect, like anybody and stuff.
And like, also like she acknowledges, like she's a human being, like she has opinions, like she likes me, which is weird. But she's not afraid to share that. And so she's just human. And anyway, unfortunately, she just found out she has cancer, which I know it's such a bummer because for her health, but also for me. And she'll be back, but she's going to be in treatment for 7 months. And what really is remarkable is like, she's like, so do you have any feelings about this that you'd like to share? And then she said, if some feelings come up for you over the next several weeks, or if you need anything, just let me know. And I was like, how about you focus on your like radiation and chemo, and I will send you some books to read. But she was still like that thoughtful, which I know if I had cancer, I would not be sitting around thinking about anybody but myself. And so like for her to like have the capacity to recognize like, I need a break because I need to focus on myself, but do you have any feelings about that? Just, 10 out of 10.
I love that. And it sounds like, and I think this is a normal practice. It sounds like you had different needs. So a therapist who was maybe more harsh or maybe more brash was good for you at that moment.
It was at that time.
And you move. Yeah. So I think that is, a very normal trajectory, that at different times in our life, we need certain personalities, we need certain treatment modalities, we need a certain therapeutic style. But what I loved just hearing about your therapist, what I love the most, besides sounds like a beautiful person and I wish her well, I do hope that she gets better soon. But it sounds like she's open to improving. And I think that that's something that clinicians oftentimes don't even give the space for their patients or their clients to even say, I kind of wish you did this more, because there is a power dynamic in place that, that you don't even, like, I didn't even know that I could even tell my therapist, and I'm a therapist. So like, it's weird. I didn't know I could tell my therapist, I wish you could actually do more of this. Cause I never felt like I had a space to even say that, cause she never asked. So,
it never occurred to me that I could give feedback because that had never been presented to me.
Exactly.
And it has actually helped me because, as a writer, you receive constant feedback. And, I tend to bristle at it. It's like, stop criticizing me. But just sort of like seeing her attitude toward feedback. I mean, I don't know how she processes it like privately on her own time, but it definitely has shown me models of being able to hold authority and create space for people to share their experiences of you.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. So we do have a couple of questions in the chat. So let me just kind of just go through them if you don't mind, just to give them a space, just to give the audience a space. So someone asked, I am very interested in trauma writing. Great. Where does one begin to approach this without causing further harm? And I'm assuming this is a clinician asking this. I'm not too sure, but I'm assuming. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think it starts with boundaries. And then, if you're working in a clinical setting and you're sort of encouraging a patient, I think before they even begin to write down the trauma, ask them, what are your boundaries? And maybe even write them down. What are you willing to disclose and what aren't you? And how are you, what creative choices do you think you want to make in doing so? And what are you going to do if someone says, I would like to know more about X? And that's, again, that contradicts your boundaries. So like helping people with developing skills for maintaining boundaries, which is actually a skill set, as you know. Absolutely. And so, I think it starts with boundaries. That's the clearest way, because when people have boundaries, that means you're not guaranteed safety, but when you have boundaries, whatever happens within the boundaries, I can tolerate and I can survive. And the boundaries shift all the time. They can expand, they can retract or contract. And it starts with that. And then I think going at the pace of the person who's writing about the trauma and sort of saying, I think you need to do X, Y, and Z. It's a, sort of let them guide you. What do you think you want to write about? And what do you think you want to accomplish? I think that giving people that semblance of control goes a very long way.
Absolutely. Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for that. The next question is, how do you manage to write so beautifully about the content of most people's about people's trauma therapy? You write beautifully.
I don't know. I mean, I wish we could identify sort of here are 3 things that I do, but sometimes, writing is something that just comes and it's hard to explain how or why you've done a thing. But I think that I lead with vulnerability, and which is a terrifying and challenging thing to do. But when you do that, it allows people to in turn make themselves vulnerable or allow themselves moments of vulnerability. And I think that a lot of productive work and honesty comes out of vulnerability and sort of admitting I'm human. I have experienced pain. I have made mistakes, whatever the vulnerability may be. Vulnerability is, I think, a really sort of great point of engagement with a lot of people.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that. The next question, Dr. Gay, what do you think about people from privileged identities leading movements to eliminate systemic oppression?
That's a very good question.
Yeah.
And, my thinking continues to evolve. In general, I think that people of privilege tend to believe they can, they know best. And I've got this. And it's no, what you have are resources and free time. Mm-hmm. So how can you use those resources and free time to support people who don't have similar resources, but probably know what their communities need better than you? Yeah. And so I think it's about knowing when to speak and when to listen, and recognizing that just because you have privilege, motivation, and resources does not mean you should be the leader. I think that means that you are well positioned to be an active follower. Mm-hmm. And so it's how can you use your privilege to support someone else in a position of leadership? Yeah. Rich people really, especially rich people, really think that they have all the answers. I'm going to solve poverty. Yeah, I'm going to solve problems. It's If you want to solve poverty, like Elon Musk, it's not about like free speech on Twitter. Nobody gives a fuck. It's about like taking a fraction of what you spent on Twitter, take $6 billion and solve world hunger. Because that's what it would take.
That's what it would
take. $5 billion and build a functioning infrastructure across the continent of Africa, or hell, the continent of North America, where infrastructure is crumbling all over the place. You know, like we know what the solutions are to world problems, and it's never the solutions that rich people think they are. Like, let's start a charter school. No, let's not. Let's not.
I love you, Dr. Gay. Okay. One more question from the audience. What is your opinion on trauma writing for personal statements for school, residency, and other types of applications? It almost feels expected for students to be vulnerable to share their trauma, yet many institutions are not ready to help these students when they join their institutions with their work on trauma.
That's another great question.
Great question. Yeah.
Unfortunately, a lot of admissions committees at every level sort of think that you have more to offer if you've been traumatized. Like, they're looking for lack of a better phrase, a sob story. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I think it's so toxic and I think it's cheap. Mm-hmm. At the same time, I don't want to ever deny someone who thinks like, this is how I can best talk about who I am, is through this lens. And so I think for a lot of people, they're just playing the game, and that's okay, because you did not invent the game and you did not invent the rules. You just know that you have to play by those rules to get to where you want to be. Mm-hmm. And so I think you have to do what you need to do. But I really wish that there was more space in admissions and sort of application processes for people to have something of value to say with or without trauma. Like, maybe you've led a charmed life. I'm sure you might still have something interesting going on. Like, I don't know what that might be, but I believe it exists. I know it exists, in fact. Mm-hmm. And I just wish that, there was space for that in admissions processes.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And let me ask this question is for me, actually, before I get to the next question, with time, I want to get to this question. If you had one tangible ask of Yale University or the Department of Psychiatry, since we're in part of their ground rounds, one explicit, achievable item of change and accountability that you want to see as a result of you being here today, what would it be?
I mean, like, pay your residents. As someone who went to Yale, who has taught at Yale, that place is a fucking mess, and there's no need for it. Yale has billions and billions and billions of dollars in endowment. Next year, across like the Ivies and the sort of public Ivies, there's going to be $1 trillion in assets and endowments. And all that money is doing is making more money. And so, like, pay your residents, pay your graduate students, and stop paying them pittances. And you know, let them unionize. Like, I just can't even believe these are conversations that need to be had, and that, like, the pay is so absolutely abject and dismal. It's just nonsense. If you want to get better candidates, pay more money. It's that simple, because when people have money to not worry about rent and bills, they're going to be more present in their practice. Mm-hmm. Like, it's a lot easier to treat a patient when you're not like worrying about, like, am I going to have to go like work a second shift somewhere else and do this and do that? And so I think that the best thing an institution like Yale can do is take the financial issues off the table at every single level. Provide free therapy to the community. I mean, come on. How is this not a thing? I mean, it might exist, but like, New Haven has a lot of problems, and Yale does very little to serve New Haven. And, you know, wow. All that privilege, and you hoard it up on sort of Science Hill and do fuck all about it. It's just like, do better. Just do better.
Thank you, Dr. Gay.
And the thing is, Yale knows this. Yale absolutely knows this. They just don't care. But I mean, fight that good fight.
Thank you. So just one more question, and then I'll hand it over to the co-chair. Let me see if we can sneak this in 1 minute. Let me look through and see which one I think. Okay, I think I like. Okay. Excuse me. I'm a female and struggling with mental health in my workplace, AKA academia. I'm constantly battling discrimination in various forms. The big channels, HR, talking to supervisors have gotten me nowhere. I confront the behavior myself, but that hasn't helped. I am constantly scared of criticism, pushback, loss of opportunity. How do I keep fighting but feel good about myself? That's that's loaded, but.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, you're not your job. And so I think the first thing is that, and we all need to do this, like to divorce what we do from who we are. However much we might love what we do, it's a job. And the more that we treat jobs as jobs instead of, as identities, the easier it is to then cope with the inevitable discrimination that we tend to deal with. And unfortunately, in the workplace, a lot of times when these things happen, people say, like, go to HR, but HR is only ever going to serve the institution, period. And you have to remember that. And so I write a column for the New York Times called Work Friend, in addition to my opinion writing. And one of the main questions I get is sort of like, I'm miserable at my job and I'm constantly criticized and disempowered in one way or another. And I don't really see a way out. What do I do? And I wish I had a good answer to offer you, because you're dealing with issues that, like, you can't perform your way out of, no matter how good a clinician you are, et cetera. And so the advice is to recognize that you are not the problem. And, I think it's important to advocate for change, but figure out how much of yourself you're willing to give to an institution that has not changed, at least in the past. I was there in I was class of 96. Yeah. Like in the past 26 years, past 100 years, past 200 years. And so in those instances where the institution, if it's going to change at all, it's going to be slow to change, you have to sort of decide, what are my limits? How much can my sanity tolerate? And at what point do I need to look elsewhere, while recognizing that there is not necessarily a sort of a better place? And then also finding systems of support beyond the workplace. I think that's one of the key, easiest, most accessible things you can do. And to recognize that you are not the problem, and to know that you are excellent, no matter what your sort of workplace is saying, and the ways that they try to tear you down, and the ways that they try to gaslight you into thinking you're the problem. You are absolutely not the problem in any way, shape, or form. And I think it's not that you give up, but you stop sort of letting them control the narrative you have about yourself as best you can. And it's something that takes time and process, of just sort of unclenching and recognizing they're never going to love me. Your job will never, ever love you. No, they won't. Your job is not your family. And it's also important to reject that kind of language when they're like, we're a family here. No, we're not, actually. My family is my family, and you are my employer. And I think that having those firm boundaries around sort of identification really helps, because nothing means an employer will exploit you more than saying that we're family. What they're saying is that I'm going to walk all over you. And so resist that at as much as possible. That's deep.
Thank you so much. I wish we had more time, but I'm sure the audience will agree with me that you just dropped so many gems to make all of us, including myself, think and reflect. So thank you so much for allowing me to share this space with you, and for, giving us your time, and really making us, including the university, really think about our role, but then also thinking about how we can move forward and make a difference, a sustainable difference. So thank you. I'm going to hand it over to Jasmine, co-chair.
Dr. Gay, Dr. Opara, thank you both for this incredible and enlightening talk. This discussion was not only inspiring, but timely. I'm sitting here with the rest of the co-chairs, and we've been cheering and feeling inspired this whole time. So thank you. I also would like to just introduce myself again as one of the conference co-chairs, Jasmine Sadatman, currently a psychiatry resident at Yale, who will be specializing in reproductive and perinatal psychiatry. And just your words, this conversation has offered perspectives that I will carry with me in my work. On behalf of all of the co-chairs, the committee members, our advisors, and our audience, Dr. Gay, thank you for all that you do. Thank you for sharing your time and your words with us. Having you here as our keynote speaker this year has really been an honor. Thank you to both Dr. Gay and Dr. Opara for being a part of our conference. And with that, I would like to thank everyone for being here today for our keynote talk, and to let the audience know about our next event, concurrent session track starting at 11:30 a.m. With links available in Whova. So I look forward to seeing you throughout the conference events today and tomorrow. Thank you.